Okay, so you want to own a nightclub. Velvet rope out front, a line of people waiting in the cold hoping to get past a bouncer, a room full of strangers paying $12 for a vodka soda that costs you about 50 cents to pour. It looks like the closest thing to printing money that exists in hospitality. A business where the product basically sells itself once the right crowd shows up, and the music is loud enough that nobody's thinking too hard about the bill. Here's the part almost nobody tells you before they sign a lease and start interviewing DJs. A nightclub is one of the most volatile, trend-dependent, regulation-heavy businesses you can possibly open. And the same room that was impossible to get into 18 months ago can be a ghost town on a Saturday night without a single thing about the building having changed. Most nightclubs fail within their first few years, quietly, expensively, and usually for reasons that have nothing to do with the drinks or the DJ booth. A small number of operators, meanwhile, are running venues that throw off genuinely serious cash, night after night, year after year. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what it costs to open one of these, how the money actually flows from the door to your pocket, what the hidden costs are that quietly bury clubs that looked packed every weekend, and what a realistic month of profit actually looks like once the fantasy gets replaced by the real math. Let's start with what it costs to get into this, because a nightclub is a much bigger financial commitment than most people picture before they start looking at spaces. Industry data on U.S. nightclub openings puts the total startup cost anywhere from around $240,000 on the low end to over $800,000 on the high end, with most serious concepts landing somewhere in the $400,000 to $500,000 range once everything is accounted for. That number includes build-out and renovation of the space, since almost no commercial unit comes ready to be a nightclub, meaning you're paying for a professional sound system, lighting rigs, a proper bar setup with enough taps and wells to serve hundreds of people quickly, climate control powerful enough to handle a packed dance floor, and often structural work to meet occupancy and fire code requirements for a late-night venue. Liquor licensing alone can be a 5- or 6-figure expense depending on the city, and in some markets liquor licenses are capped in number and have to be purchased on a secondary market from an existing holder rather than simply applied for, which can push that single line item into serious money before you've bought a single bottle of vodka. Add security equipment, point-of-sale systems built for high-volume bar service, furniture, decor, and the marketing spend needed to make opening night actually feel like an event. And it's easy to see how a modest neighborhood lounge and a genuine big-room nightclub can require wildly different budgets while technically falling under the same business category. Some ambitious large-format concepts model total initial capital expenditure north of $1 million once VIP table infrastructure, premium sound and lighting design, and a marketing runway are all included, which tells you just how wide this spectrum really is. From a modest lounge a determined operator can open for a few $100,000, up to a full-scale entertainment venue that costs more than most restaurants will ever gross in a year. So how does the money actually flow once the doors are open? Here's the part that makes nightclub economics genuinely unusual compared to almost any other hospitality business. Alcohol carries an extraordinarily high gross margin, typically somewhere between 70% and 80%, since the actual cost of the liquor going into a well drink or a beer is a small fraction of what it sells for once poured, mixed, and served in a room where people came specifically to spend money on a good night out. Cover charges add a second layer on top of that, pure revenue with almost no direct cost of goods attached, since you're charging for entry rather than a product. And then there's the revenue stream that actually separates a merely busy club from a genuinely lucrative one: VIP bottle service. A single bottle of liquor that might retail for $30 or $40 in a store can be sold at a VIP table for several $100s once you add in the markup, the mixers, the reserved seating, and the experience of not waiting in a regular bar line. And a club with even a modest number of tables filled on a strong night can generate a meaningful share of total revenue from bottle service alone. That's why the smartest operators treat table inventory the way an airline treats seats, actively managing which nights get premium pricing and which get promotional deals to keep tables full. Because an empty VIP section on a Saturday night is pure lost revenue, that can never be recovered. Here's the number that explains why this business looks so profitable on paper, and yet so many operators still struggle. Gross margin on beverages is enormous, but the overall net profit margin for the average bar or club in the industry sits much lower, commonly cited around 5 to 12% once you work all the way down through labor, rent, and overhead, though well-run clubs in strong locations can push considerably higher than that, with some benchmarks putting healthy mid-size venues in the 20 to 30% range, and the largest, best-run rooms even higher. The gap between that eye-popping 70+% pour margin and the much thinner bottom-line number is basically the entire story of this industry. Now for the stuff nobody warns you about before opening night. First, labor. A nightclub needs a genuinely large staff running simultaneously during peak hours. Bartenders, barbacks, servers, security, coat check, door staff, and often a promoter or two, and payroll for a venue running at full capacity on weekend nights routinely represents one of the single largest ongoing costs in the business, frequently rivaling or exceeding the cost of the alcohol itself. Second, security and insurance. Late-night venues serving alcohol to large crowds carry liability exposure that most other businesses simply don't have to think about, and insurance premiums, security staffing, and the cost of maintaining compliance with occupancy limits and safety regulations all add up to a real, recurring expense that scales with the size of the crowd you're trying to attract. Third, and this is the one that quietly kills more clubs than almost anything else, is the trend cycle. Nightlife is fashion. A venue can be the hottest room in the city for a year, sometimes two, and then lose its cultural momentum almost overnight, as the crowd moves on to whatever opened more recently. And unlike a restaurant that can survive on consistent quality and repeat customers, a nightclub's core audience is often chasing a feeling of being somewhere relevant, which is brutally hard to sustain indefinitely. Fourth, promoter and talent costs. Bringing in a recognizable DJ or booking a promoter with a large following to guarantee a crowd isn't optional in competitive markets. It's often the difference between a full room and an empty one, and those costs can range from a few $100s for a local resident DJ to tens of thousands for a touring headliner on a marquee night. Money that has to be spent before you know for certain the crowd will show up to cover it. Fifth, regulatory risk. Liquor licenses can be suspended over a single serious incident. Noise complaints from neighbors can trigger operating restrictions, and cities have periodically cracked down on nightlife districts entirely, meaning a portion of the risk in this business isn't really business risk at all. It's political and regulatory risk, sitting entirely outside your control. So who's actually winning at this? At the top end, large-scale entertainment groups that operate multiple venues across major markets have built real institutional businesses by treating nightlife like a portfolio, diversifying across several rooms so that one club's slow season doesn't sink the whole operation, and by locking in relationships with talent agencies and promoters that guarantee a pipeline of draw, independent of any single trend. Some large nightclub operations model annual revenue well into the hundreds of millions when you look at the biggest branded groups running venues across multiple cities, with EBITDA margins that can run above 50% at the operating level before corporate overhead, which shows just how much cash a genuinely well-run, well-located club can generate at scale. In the middle tier, independent operators who've found a defensible niche, a specific music genre, a specific crowd, a neighborhood with limited competition, have built durable single-location businesses by keeping their VIP program disciplined and their labor costs tightly matched to actual demand, rather than staffing for the busiest possible night every single night. The pattern that shows up again and again is that the clubs which survive past that critical first couple of years aren't necessarily the ones with the biggest opening night. They're the ones that built a repeatable weekly draw instead of depending entirely on one moment of hype. How do people actually lose money on this? Almost nobody fails because their drinks were bad or their sound system sounded thin. They fail because they modeled the business off their best possible Saturday night and built their fixed costs, their lease, their staffing levels, their loan payments, around a revenue number that only shows up a few nights a month, while Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and slow Sundays quietly bleed cash the whole time. The second common trap is overspending on the build-out, pouring the entire opening budget into design and sound before the venue has proven it can actually pull a consistent crowd, which leaves nothing in reserve for the inevitable slow stretch every club goes through as it establishes itself. Okay, so what can you actually walk away with? Take a realistic mid-size club doing a healthy but not spectacular weekend business, generating somewhere around $25,000 to $30,000 a month in average revenue, which aligns with industry benchmarks for a solidly performing venue outside the biggest metro markets. After beverage cost of goods, which even at a strong gross margin still represents a real expense once you're pouring at volume, labor for a full weekend staff, rent, insurance, and marketing, a realistic net profit margin in that 10 to 20% range leaves you with something in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $5,000 a month in genuine take-home profit, a real number, but a far cry from the cash business printing money reputation the industry carries. Now the stronger version. A well-located, well-run club in a major market that's built a consistent VIP table program, strong promoter relationships, and a genuine weekly following can push into the 20 to 30% net margin range that top operators achieve, and on monthly revenue that scales into six figures for a venue with real capacity and multiple revenue nights a week. That translates into tens of thousands of dollars in monthly profit, the kind of number that starts to explain why serious hospitality groups keep expanding their nightlife portfolios even as individual clubs come and go around them. So yeah, you can open a nightclub and, if the room catches on, watch it become the most profitable square footage you'll ever own. Most people who try this will discover that the crowd they built their business plan around moved on to a different room within a year or two, and that the gap between a 70% pour margin and an actual profitable business is filled entirely with labor, rent, security, and a level of week-to-week discipline the glamorous version of this business never mentions. The ones who make it work aren't the ones who threw the best opening night. They're the ones who built something people wanted to come back to every single weekend, not just once.